That lovely introduction and for reading part of my website. That was pretty good. I wonder who wrote that. You know, it's tough to sit here in a chair silently and hear somebody a couple of feet away talking about all the things that you do. But that's the nature of our work, isn't it? You know, I think Swami and I are both introverted loners who ended up in leadership positions and at the sort of hub of the wheels of various communities. And I think a lot of people in the arts and in academia are like that. We're driven out of our introverted isolation and solitude by this need for this connection. And so I'm just always thrilled when I get an email from Swami, hey, can you come talk? And then we both realized today was actually literally Earth Day. And that meant two things, that I got to talk about one of my favorite things, spirituality and nature. It also meant I had to get here super early because we're so close to Balboa Park. I was a little worried about parking being a problem. Of course, it wasn't a problem at all because most of the stuff we worry about never happens. And so I got here at 10 and like the neighborhood is abandoned and I got a spot right up front. So there you go. So I had a lovely morning this morning. My wife, Lori, and I got up early as we always do, and we head out the door. I live over in San Carlos near Lake Murray, Cowles Mountain, all that stuff. And we walk our dog around Lake Murray every day, and we've lived in that house for over 20 years. So 365 times, I don't know, over 7,000 times we've done this, and it's glorious, and every day is different. The lake never looks the same twice. And like a lot of you, when we're hiking around through these beautiful trails in our beautiful part of the world, you see trash and you pick it up. And especially on a lake shore, you see a lot of fishing line and left behind by frustrated fishermen. Is that okay? Fisher women? It's awkward. Fisher thems who abandon their clusters of monofilament line, often with treble hooks still in them. And it only takes one time when you're walking around the lake to see a barn owl, a beautiful white bird of prey, a nocturnal creature, hanging by its talons from a branch, dead, with its wings outstretched like an inverted crucifix, tangled in monofilament line from which it could not extract itself. You only need to see that one time, and then you become a maniac about picking up monofilament line every time you see it. And the first phase of picking up fishing line is one of resentment, anger, and judgment. You're picking this up going, who are these horrible people, these murderers who leave this stuff around? And then you realize, I'm turning this whole altruistic act into an ego trip that self-aggrandizes me and hierarchicizes me over other people. Because believe me, I go unconsciously through the world and cause just as much damage in my own ways. I don't leave behind wads of fishing line, but you know what I mean? And so it was fascinating to me because in philosophy, you always step into what Krishna calls the inner witness in the Gita. You're always, what's Peter Bolland doing right now? What's he thinking? Why is he reacting this way? What is the real root of that emotional response? And it just became this fascinating moment of pedagogical power. I kind of learned that what a lousy habit to have, to go through the world always sneering internally in resentment at others over their imperfections and never looking at my own. It's all in Matthew, right? Don't worry about the speck in your neighbor's eye, worry about the beam in your own eye. And I learned a lot from a piece of fishing line. And that's what nature does. That's what our time in nature does. It somehow removes many of the obstacles that keep us distracted and busy. And suddenly we encounter the real in a more immediate way. And I mean that literally, in a way without mediation. There's nothing in between you and it. You know, that great Meister Eckhart line, the eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me. And so that is just one tiny little vignette that I love about spending time in nature. And I'll leave you with another one here before we get into some of these other ideas. Some years back, Lori and I were camping out in Anza Borrego. And you know what that means. It's just so gorgeous out there, especially right now. and the flowers are amazing. And the big people, I see everybody's bighorn sheep pictures on Facebook. It's pretty epic out there. And San Diego County is a remarkable place. And in about 90 minutes, you can be in all kinds of different ecosystems. And so we, like a lot of you all, have camped out in Anza Borrego, and it's just a wonderful thing. And we're in the campground, and that wonderful time when you're tent camping, when you've had dinner, you've washed up, you put the dishes away, and got a campfire going, of course. And Lori got sleepy, so she crawled off into the tent. Maybe it was getting late, which for people our age meant it was probably 9 o'clock. And she crawled off and went to sleep. And I thought, well, I'm just gonna lay here a little longer in the chase lounges that we had borrowed from the backyard, and I'm just gonna look up at the stars, because that's one of the joys of going to the desert, right? And you look at these stars, and it's just an ocean, a field of stars. And you can see the Milky Way. It's just ridiculous when you get away from all the light pollution of the city. And something really strange happened on this one evening. I was laying there on this chase lounge, looking up at the sky, and I can't explain why this happened, but suddenly I had this thought that I'm not on top of the earth. Imagine the earth being round, of course, and we always think we're on top, don't we? And I was laying there looking up at the sky, and then I suddenly had this thought, what if I'm on the bottom of the earth looking down into the stars, and gravity is gluing me to the planet, but I'm actually looking down into outer space? I got a little dizzy and almost, lost my dinner there. And it was a fleeting moment. This all happened in 2 seconds, but it was a startling shift. And I know, kind of a obvious realization that we don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we are, as the Talmud says, that it is just so solipsistic and self-centered to always assume that I am on top of the planet and everybody else is hanging off the bottom like bats in a cave. That maybe I'm hanging off the bottom, but there is no up and down in space. And so there's another one of those weird nature moments that really reordered the way I looked at the world. And that's hard to get when you're on your couch in the living room and the baseball game's on and you're scrolling through your Facebook feed. That's a wonderful experience too. I was doing that just last night. But this morning is, on a day like today, you start to think a little bigger. So I think there's something about wild places. And the talk today is called Nature Mysticism, East and West. And I didn't know what else to call it, because I want to just think through a few different perspectives with you about how nature has the capacity to teach, to shift us, and to open our hearts and minds. And when I think about the wisdom of wilderness, I think about John Muir, and who is in many ways our own American mystic. And we don't normally talk about John Muir a lot in religious studies or in spirituality, but maybe we should. And when you read John Muir and learn about his life, it's a really, really remarkable story. And I want to share a little bit of it with you here. Some of you might not know who he is at all. Every Sierra Club member knows who he is because he's the founder of the Sierra Club, etc. But he was born in Scotland in 1838. And John Muir's father was a very, very strict Christian, as folks often were in the 1830s. And I've read really weird accounts about his childhood. His father made little John memorize the entire New Testament and most of the Old Testament, as Christians call it, as well. That's a life of profoundly disciplined coercion. And that, however, I can see the value too of internalizing wisdom texts like that. But I think young John Muir's real baptism was just roaming around as a boy in the Scottish Highlands and on the coasts, the craggy coasts of Scotland. And when he was 11 years old, the whole family picked up and emigrated to America. So at the age of 11, John Muir finds himself as a boy in Wisconsin, growing up there with his Scottish immigrant family. And he tried college for a few years, but he drifted away. It's hard to fit into programs and disciplines like that. He wandered down to the he walked down to the Gulf of Mexico. He got on a steamer, not knowing where it was going. It ended up going through the Panama Canal and landing on the West Coast. He said, okay, California, let's check that out. And he walked up into the foothills of the Sierras and he found this place called Yosemite that wasn't Yosemite yet then. It was just Native American land that had been invaded quite recently by some ranchers who were grazing cattle in Yosemite Valley. And John Muir fell in love with the place, as a lot of us are who've ever been to Yosemite. And he knew very well from his biblical immersion that it was into the wilderness that people went when they wanted to have these profound depth experiences of their own inner life. And from the Hebrew prophets to Jesus, all of those to the church mothers and fathers of the early monastic tradition, mostly in Egypt, as the Roman church was cooking over in Rome, over in Egypt, they didn't have a church. It was just a lot of individual seekers entering into that nascent Christian movement in those first couple of centuries, going into the desert to live alone, men and women, who become the seeds of what we now call monasticism in the West. From the Latin monad, to become one, and to be in solitude, in oneness, which is also to say to be part of everythingness. And John Muir later wrote that the clearest way into the universe is through a forest wilderness. That the microcosm always contains the macrocosm. And then John Muir also later wrote this. He said, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. And this, by the way, is of course the testimony of mystics the world over. This is the wisdom you come to embody when you spend any quality time at all in the wilderness. The fundamental interconnectedness of all energy, matter, and consciousness. It's no longer a doctrine or a theory or something somebody said in a wonderful, well-respected book. It's something that you fall into. It's an awareness that overtakes you, that comes out of yourself in those situations. And it's in the testimony of the Chinese Buddhist and Taoist poets. And it's in the oral traditions of the shaman, of all the indigenous traditions. And it's in the poetry and the painting and the music of the Romantic movement, in the landscapes of Turner and the symphonies of Beethoven, in the heartbreaking, intimate piano nocturnes of Frédéric Chopin. And so wherever we turn, we see artists and seekers and seers and sages trying to voice the ineffable that you and I experience ourselves when we are in wilderness, and that there is not one thing apart from anything else. And is that not what our soul is asking us to experience and re-experience and re-experience? Even back in 1980, and I had to look this up to see exactly when this happened. Growing up as a kid in Southern California, and that's another thing Swami and I have in common, although I'm a bit older than he is, but so I was 22 in 1980. You were probably like 6 or something, but in 1980 I was 22, and there was a thing on TV called Cosmos. Do you remember that? The original one with Carl Sagan?
Yes.
Yeah. Maybe some of you have seen it. The young folks, you can find it on YouTube. I know Neil Tyson deGrasse has kind of relaunched that whole thing because he's kind of a disciple of Carl Sagan, right? So anyway, the original one, Carl Sagan, who was an astrophysicist by trade, and I'm always drawn to academics like him and like Joseph Campbell and teachers like Deepak Chopra, people who become discipline experts in a highly arcane and esoteric professional field, and instead of staying in that bubble, they come back down to the marketplace and talk to us about it. And that means they have to translate. I remember hearing that Nobel Prize winning economist, and I never had one class on economics. I couldn't tell you anything about economics. But I remember hearing on NPR an interview of a Nobel Prize winning economist. And the interviewer asked him, you know, what do you think is the most important thing about your job? And he said, well, you know, I think at this level, whether it's physics, astrophysics, or economics, if you can't explain your work to a 12-year-old, then you're no good at your job. And so it is guys like Carl Sagan who can take astrophysics, for God's sakes, and turn it into a TV show that keeps me, a 20-year-old, glued to the screen. And I remember him saying all kinds of amazing things. He said something that electrified me and got tattooed into my consciousness. I never forgot it. And Carl Sagan, by the way, is an atheist. He has no interest in religion at all. He's a materialist. But he said this, he says, as we contemplate nature and the universe, we are the universe contemplating itself. I'm like, that's Vedanta. That Brahman takes form as all of these embodied creatures. And when I long for union with God, that is God longing for union with itself. And he would frame it as, well, this is what happened with evolution. Material evolution got so sophisticated that it became conscious. And so from his perspective, we are the universe's effort to become conscious of itself. I thought that's pretty good TV. So we are the vehicle through which the universe comes to know and connect with itself. So again, John Muir wrote it this way in the 1850s. The sun shines not on us, but in us. The rivers flow not past, but through us, thrilling, tingling, vibrating every fiber and cell of the substance of our bodies, making them glide and sing. The trees wave and the flowers bloom in our bodies as well as in our souls. And every bird song, wind song, and tremendous storm song of the rocks in the heart of the mountains is our song, our very own, and sings our love, end quote. And then we remember that the word universe means, at least etymologically from Latin, means one song. That this is a song that is singing us, and that we are, like concert goers, enjoying the songs of everything around us as well. You know, there's a lot of books by John Muir, but I'm thinking of one where I think it's called In Yosemite or something like that. And he just talks about hiking around Yosemite on his own, of course. And they didn't have Gore-Tex or any of the cool modern fabrics. This is all in wool and cotton. And just what it's like in the rain. And he got so excited about storms, this really gnarly storm, and came one day and it was howling and all the trees were going like this. He's like, this is awesome. I got to experience this. So he climbed all the way up in a Douglas fir, which was whipping back and forth, and just hung on. I think if a forest ranger came by, they would probably discourage that kind of thing, but he was free from all of those restrictions. That's the extent to which he liked to throw his way into this. And then in 1903, then President Theodore Roosevelt was touring the West, himself in weird ways a nature lover, although it was his cultural tradition to shoot everything that he saw and mount it. You know, he was a big game hunter, which was like really a cool thing. Ever read Hemingway? That was a thing a lot of powerful men did. They did it in India, all this hunting tourism. It's one of the reasons the tigers are almost gone, et cetera, et cetera. Now we see that all through a different lens today. But if you grew up in hunting culture, which is still very richly a part of the American fabric of life in places like Montana, where everybody grows up with guns and wildlife management is a part of how you interact with nature, et cetera, et cetera. It's difficult for me to understand, but there it is. So that was Teddy Roosevelt's thing. He liked to shoot stuff and kept a lot of trophies, but he loved the environment and loved nature. And when he got to California, I can't imagine president's doing this today, just going on a 3-month camping trip through the West. And that's how much he wanted to get out of DC too. And he got to California, he goes, and he told his crew, he's like, I want to meet John Muir. I've heard some things. So they went up to Yosemite, and by then it was starting to get a little more developed. And there were a few buildings and structures. And President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, met John Muir, and John Muir said, come on, let's go. And they went camping up to Glacier Point. And if you know Yosemite Valley, you always drive up to Glacier Point. It's an overlook, and it's where you take a lot of pictures. They camped up there for one night. And when they woke up, there was a thin dusting of snow on their blankets, and they got up and they went to the edge, and there's a famous picture of them both standing there at Glacier Point. And I don't know about you, but I just wish every American president could go camping with John Muir. It would really change things. And so that, I think, had a big impact. Of course, politically, what resulted from all of that was the idea of the national park was born on that snowy night. The idea that the American, it's one of the best ideas America ever came up with. And it's come up with a few good ideas, and there's a lot of horrible imperfection as well, but we don't have time for that. But the idea of setting land apart in perpetuity to be not developed for commercial concern, to not be privately owned, but to be owned by the people. And I know it's an imperfect institution. It displaced a lot of indigenous people. It is, what does it say in chapter 18 of the Bhagavad Gita? Just as a fire is surrounded by smoke, every action is surrounded by imperfection. So even something noble like setting aside land has its costs. But that idea has made immersion in wilderness a possibility for a lot of us modern urban people who escape to these islands to experience directly this thing that we're thinking about today, the mysticism of nature. So when I finally got to my first college classes, and I grew up in Ventura, and I went to Ventura College, and then I went to undergrad to complete my bachelor's degree up the road in Santa Barbara, at UC Santa Barbara. So I liked living on the coast there. We always grew up on the beach, and I took my first philosophy classes, and I really connected with the stories of the Buddha and the stories of Hinduism and Jesus and the desert fathers and mothers and all of those, because they were all going to the wilderness. And that struck me. And studying and throwing myself into indigenous American studies and their vision questing and how connected that was to nature. And I started to understand what Henry David Thoreau meant when, after living alone in the woods at Walden Pond for a couple of years, he wrote, at the very end of that masterpiece, Walden, he wrote, I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front or face only the essential facts of life, and to see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. So like a lot of us, Thoreau was just weary of society. And it's wonderful to live in society, but it's also kind of exhausting to have that mask on and to be in performative mode all the time. And to just be alone, you get to just drop that, and you start to learn things about yourself that are hidden by all of that performative engagement. Later, he wrote that if a man walks in the woods for love of them half of each day, he is in danger of being regarded as a loafer. But if he spends his days as a speculator, shearing off those woods and making the earth bald before her time, he is deemed an industrious and enterprising citizen. It won't be long before Thoreau is banned. You know, a lot of books are being banned in America right now. Thoreau's next, because that is going to be perceived as an attack on capitalism and industry. And it is. It's the question, is like, what are we here to do? Make money only? Or is there something more sacred and profound underway? He writes, heaven is under our feet as well as over our heads. which reminds me so much of what Jesus says in the Gospel of Thomas. People are always asking him, show us where heaven is, show us where the Father's kingdom is so that we can find it. And in the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, what you look for has already come. The Father's kingdom is lying about you all over the earth, only you do not see it. So we do not have a proximity problem, we have a perception problem. And that's the great mystical teaching of all the traditions. This is nirvana. Drop the duality between samsara and nirvana. Samsara bad, must get to nirvana. But the ultimate realization is, with the realization of nirvana, you never left home. It's Dorothy in bed in the last scene of The Wizard of Oz. There's no place like home. And there she is, and there's her uncle and her mom and her dad and Toto, and they're all the characters. You're like, oh, those are all the characters from the movie. That's the Tin Man and the Scarecrow, and there's the... And so we have to go out to come in. And that's the hero's journey. And so going out to the desert doesn't take us just to the desert. It takes us in here. And that's what all of our stories and our films and that's what our great storytelling must do. So Ralph Thoreau had an older friend in the village of Concord, Massachusetts. His name was Ralph Waldo Emerson. I want to touch on him as well. And both Thoreau and Emerson are such interesting touchstones. I've spoken about that before here, because they were both young kids at Harvard University. And by the way, going to Harvard University in the 1830s was different than going now. It didn't cost $200,000 a minute to go to Harvard. Thoreau and Emerson could work a summer part-time job for a few months in the summer, and that would pay for their tuition at Harvard all year. I mean, that's the egalitarian vision of what American higher education is supposed to be. I just wish it was free. So anyway, Emerson and Thoreau, when they were young'uns, they went to Harvard. And think about what's happening in Harvard in the 1820s and 30s. It's right there in Boston Harbor. Think of what's happening in India. It's the height of the Victorian imperial conquest of India. And all of the sacred literature of India, the Vedas and the Puranas and the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita, are being translated into English crudely by English scholars who are learning Sanskrit and so on and trying their best to, hey, these are these great texts, let's put them in English. And those books are coming into the harbor at Boston Harbor. They're going on the shelf at Harvard. Thoreau and Emerson are the first generation of Americans to encounter this, Vedanta. And this is all documented beautifully in a book by Philip Goldberg called American Veda. And I gave a talk about that book at Oasis many years ago, and somebody brought Swami to that talk. That's how we first met, was that day. And I'm just really caught by that story of how those traditions came together. So when you read Emerson and Thoreau and start to understand their spirituality, and it doesn't sound exactly like Christianity. It doesn't sound even like Unitarianism, which is the very sort of liberal, progressive Christianity. It's something else is going on, and it's this. This non-duality is becoming a part of American spirituality through their voices. And so Emerson, in his first book called Nature, published in 1836, he wrote perhaps the most famous passage in all of American mystical literature, and I want to share it with you. It's not very long. It's the famous transparent eyeball passage. So like a lot of us, Emerson's just out in the woods walking around, and he has an experience, a shift, and he wrote about it, and this is what he said. He said, "In the woods, we return to reason and faith. There, I feel nothing can befall me in life, no disgrace, no calamity, which nature cannot repair. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all, The currents of universal being, capital U, capital B, the currents of universal being circulate through me. I am part or parcel of God. I am the lover of uncontained and immortal beauty. In the wilderness, I find something more dear and more connate, that means, I guess, knowable or relatable. In wilderness, I find something more dear and connate than in streets and villages. In the tranquil landscape, and especially in the distant line of the horizon, man beholds somewhat as beautiful as his own nature. So that is a rather remarkable moment in American religious writing that doesn't feel much like the Gospels. Something else is happening, and it is this global interfaith dialogue. And we live in really exciting times here in the 21st century in that sense, that the 20th century was a time of borders collapsing, not literally, but philosophically and religiously, because of many different people that brought these ideas over here. The establishment of the Vedanta Society here in Southern California is a perfect example of that. And the teachings of this wonderful 19th century Hindu saint Ramakrishna becoming part of the dialogue of 20th century American and European and global spirituality. Now, I want to give you a little memo from the world of academic philosophy on all of this. There's a new thing happening in one of the subcategories of philosophy called metaphysics. Metaphysics is that branch of philosophy that studies reality, asks questions like, what is reality? So there's a new metaphysical theory that's really in kind of catching on right now. I would say it's practically hot. It's practically exciting. Alongside all the old ones, materialism and duality and non-duality and et cetera, monism. And the word is panpsychism. So you're accessing your etymological files here. Pan means all, and psyche from the Greek means, in a word, consciousness. Panpsychism is the metaphysical position that says that all reality is conscious. And that's, of course, a challenge to the 16th and 17th century Cartesian worldview that we call dualism, that mind and body are two separate realities. From René Descartes, we get the Christian mind and body duality further codified into now a scientific position. And out of the philosophy of Descartes, we got this idea in the Western worldview that my body is a bag of meat, and in it lives a soul. And the soul makes my arms move around and makes my mouth say things. And that when the body dies, the soul goes on. And that's the Christian sort of perspective, that the soul is immortal, but the body is just part of the ephemeral, transitory world. So that's dualism. In fact, Descartes, toward the end of his life, even did some surgeries, some autopsies, to try to determine in which part of the brain exactly did the soul plug in to the body. And furthermore, in Cartesian dualism, that which we call the body and that which we call the soul, these two parallel and largely separate realities, are governed by separate laws. And the laws of one don't apply to the laws of the other. So the whole universe got ripped into two things. And Descartes further concluded that I can't even be certain of the world of sensation, therefore the world of matter. But I know that I am thinking these things, so cogito ergo sum. Therefore, I'm thinking this, so therefore I exist. So contemporary non-duality teacher Eckhart Tolle says it's all Descartes' fault. This horrible split between mind and body, and that we all go around thinking that we are our thoughts. And then in these meditation traditions, we start to experience, well, actually, thoughts are happening, but they're happening inside of a space that is not thought. And when we meditate, we go into that boundlessness that we are. That is where thought happens. And so it's sort of exciting to me that people in philosophy, which are usually the last folks to catch on to anything, because they're so tradition bound, are talking about panpsychism, and it's just wild. Now, that doesn't mean that this glass of water is having thoughts right now. Consciousness doesn't mean conceptual thought. I have houseplants at home, like many of you have, and have you noticed that the houseplant on the kitchen counter near the window always faces its leaves toward the window? And then you turn the plant around, and you can just feel the plant going, ah. And then slowly it has to rearrange its molecular structure and turn its photon receptors toward the light source. Is that a kind of consciousness? I think it is. It's responding to stimuli. It's exerting volition, the will to live. So consciousness can mean many things. So panpsychism is just a delightful way of exploring the possibility that all of this is Brahman, and it is all identical with the ground of being. And I wonder how connected panpsychism is to the Vedanta insights, the monism of Advaita Vedanta particularly, and the Namaste idea, the idea that we are that. And so now, out of the academic disciplines of philosophy comes this crazy new idea. And it's a lot like the Buddhist idea of dependent arising as well. The idea that everything comes into being in deep interconnectedness with everything else that is coming into being. And that nothing is the singular cause of anything else, that everything is causing everything, which is a really compelling portrait of how things happen. It also makes it very difficult to solve problems. Like, how do you fix poverty? Knowing that poverty has tens of thousands of causes, millions of causes. And it's what the great contemporary Zen Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh calls interbeing. And there's a beautiful passage from Thich Nhat Hanh I want to leave you with. It's from his book called Love Letter to the Earth. I thought this might be appropriate today. He says, at this very moment, the earth is above you, below you, all around you, even inside you. The earth is everywhere. You may be used to thinking of the earth as only the ground beneath your feet. But the water, the sea, the sky, and everything around us comes from the earth. Everything outside us and everything inside us comes from the earth. We often forget that the planet we are living on has given us all the elements that make up our bodies. The water in our flesh, our bones, and all the microscopic cells inside our bodies all come from the earth and remain a part of the earth. The earth is not just the environment we live in. We are the earth. And we are always carrying her with us. I love that passage. It reminds me of that night I thought I was hanging from the earth and looking down into the stars. It just gives me a new way of thinking about that. I think that I'm walking around on the earth. I don't think of myself as an aspect of the earth walking around. That every bit of my mind-body cathedral comes from Gaia, Mahadevi, Shakti, Mary, all the names of the great goddess of this planet. So he goes on, realizing this, we can see that the earth is truly alive. Let me stop. In the Cartesian sense, the material world is innate. Excuse me, that's not the word I want. The material world is inert. It's just a thing. And from that dualistic consciousness, the planet is just a free Costco. And I get to go down and take this timber and bring up that petroleum and mine these valuable minerals. And whoever gets there first with the biggest bulldozers gets to be rich and have an empire. But when you shift out of that dualistic consciousness into this, and the whole earth becomes just as sacred as you, or as your idea of God, he goes on then, realizing this, we can see that the earth is truly alive. We are a living, breathing manifestation of this beautiful, generous planet. Knowing this, we can begin to transform our relationship to the earth. We can begin to walk differently and to care for her differently. We will fall completely in love with the earth. And when we are in love with someone or something, there is no separation between ourselves and the thing we love. We do whatever we can for them, and this brings us great joy and nourishment. That is the relationship each of us can have with the earth. That is the relationship each of us must have with the earth, he writes, if the earth is to survive, and if we are to survive as well. So all that was from Thich Nhat Hanh's wonderful book, Love Letter to the Earth. So in closing then, maybe this is why depth experiences in wilderness are so common, so ubiquitous throughout the world's wisdom traditions, its spiritual, its philosophical traditions. When we deeply experience wilderness, whether in the high Sierras or later today in your own backyard or neighborhood park, we experience ourselves, our deepest, most sacred selves, revealed by our vulnerable willingness to see ourselves in each other and in the land and the trees and the waters of this beautiful planet. So it's not a new doctrine we're after. It's not a more perfect theology that's going to save us, or a better explanation that's going to set us free. It's a deeper awareness of what is right in front of us and right within us. An awareness beyond all doctrines, beyond all explanations. So it's not a new world we need. It is new eyes with which to see the world, and time and nature gives us those eyes. And that, I think, is the wisdom of wilderness. And finally, let me close with a brief poem from one of my favorite contemporary poets. She just passed away a couple of years ago. You know who she is, probably, Mary Oliver. And I'm going to go with her greatest hits. This is her most famous poem by far. It's called Wild Geese. And I think of this poem a lot. I'm trying to memorize it, but I'm terrible at memorizing things. Because I think it really, like a lot of like one of her patron saint poets, Walt Whitman, she spent time in nature and writes what we would sort of dismissively call nature poetry. But it's ordinary English, it cuts right through, and look at what she does in this short poem around spirituality, around religion, around redemption, around ritual, around prayer, around nature. So, Mary Oliver, Wild Geese. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clear blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. Namaste. Well, we wanted to leave a little time for some conversation afterwards, Swami.
Yes, so at this point, we'll open it up for a Q&A session. So if you have any questions, just please wait for the mic.
And then we'll do a song later, or?
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right. I'd love to hear from you, but we have a lot of folks on Zoom who are joining us. So when you ask your comment, or when you say your comment or question, put that mic right up close, like you're trying to get to know it. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Really enjoyed the talk, and I don't know about anybody else, but I'm ready to go on a camping trip to Yosemite.
Let's go.
The weather's perfect for it.
Yes.
At any rate, there were 3 words that I thought were important that came up during the talk, which are philosophy, religion, and spirituality.
Mm.
And I think I'd be really interested in how you distinguish those 3 as well as how they relate to one another. I know it's a big question, but I throw it at you anyway.
That's fine. Thank you. I love that. Let me see. How much time do we have? No, I'm just kidding. You know, it is our blessing and our curse as highly evolved Homo sapiens to have this trickery of language and to have named the world. And so we do our best to name these various human endeavors. Philosophy is a human endeavor, and spirituality is a human endeavor. And what was the other one? Philosophy, spirituality, and religion, another pretty big human endeavor. So religion, the word religion comes from religio or relegare, meaning to link back or link together. So we call things religions when they are traditions, sort of clustered, like communities clustered around certain metaphysical positions, certain communal rituals. There's some attempt to contact the sacred, and it's about binding us back together with one another in the community and with ultimate reality. So that's what we mean by religions. And the standards, the epistemological standards, there are different than they are in philosophy. At least in the Western philosophical tradition, the epistemological standards are something isn't true until you can rationally demonstrate it. In religion, that goes away. You have that and the mystery of faith and direct experience and ineffable mystical contact and things that can't be demonstrated, certainly not empirically or even in rational argumentation. So religion and spirituality kind of are adjacent, aren't they? And one of the things that attracted me to the Indian traditions as a student was that they don't make a lot of fuss about keeping the two separate from one another. That in what we call in the West Hinduism, or more properly in the Sanatana Dharma, there are dozens of darshanas or schools, and some are highly logically, severe, and others are completely devotionally, irrationally, madly wonderful, and don't have much interest in demonstrating anything logically to anybody. It's about crawling on your knees and breaking open. And so, whereas in the West, religion and philosophy got divorced pretty early on. There are counterpoints to that claim, but generally, certainly in the Christian tradition, Paul, even in his letters to the New Testament, warns us against philosophy. Philosophers, he says, are dangerous because they can make anything sound true. Thank you. Which is a criticism Plato had too in his dialogues. He was critical and cautious about that as well. Be careful, because when you get clever at language, then you just become a sophist, and you can make anything sound pretty and true, and then all of a sudden lies sound just as convincing as truths. And so, just like a kitchen knife, you can feed people with it, or you can kill people with it. And so those endeavors, have their own sort of principalities, their own sovereignty. And then spirituality is, everywhere I go, and I do talks like this all over the place, and I meet a lot of people who are ex-evangelicals. Is that a word? That's probably a word we need, right? People like Rachel Held Evans, may she rest in peace, and some of my other favorite writers like Brian McLaren. These are people who did not grow up like me. They grew up in Bible-thumping fundamentalist homes. They believe in the literal word of God. Everybody who's not a Protestant or a Baptist is going to hell. You know the deal. And they have left that branch of Christianity and opened up and started dialoguing with people like this and people in their own Abrahamic faith family and Muslims and Jews. And I'm really caught by those particular Christian voices because a lot of them say, when you ask them if they're religious, well, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. And in my line of work in religious studies, that's a whole demographic category. We call them SBNRs, spiritual but not religious. It's one of the fastest growing demographics in the American religious landscapes. They're also called nuns, N-O-N-E. None of, because when you ask them on a survey, which religion are you, they check that last box, none of the above. But guess what? They believe in God to the same percentage as the people who check a religious box. They just no longer think that God is someone somewhere. They use the word God as a placeholder for what in Vedanta we call Brahman, which is the ground of being that takes forms as many delightful personifications and as us too, and as this beautiful art behind me. And so to traditional theists, those people are crazy, or atheists. Spinoza tried to do that in 17th century Holland when he broke away from his Orthodox Jewish synagogue and started talking about God in a very Vedanta way as the name of the substance of which everything is made. And everybody just thought he was an atheist. But actually what he was trying to do was talk about God in a way 100 times bigger than anybody else was. And so when I hear the word spiritual, I often think these are the folks that are kind of out there doing it on their own, and they're taking pieces from different traditions. We come to the Vedanta Monastery to hear a talk. We go to church tomorrow morning. We go to a Sufi dance tomorrow afternoon, and then we go home and we light some incense and read some psalms, and then we go to a Native American sweat lodge with our Kumeyaay buddies out at Sequan on Monday. And we're like, we don't care. These are all windows through which the eternal comes into our lives. Why would I hierarchize that? So that suits some people, and we call those people spiritual. And guess what? There are a lot of people here who are like that. And I go to a Christian church. I go to St. Paul's Episcopal Cathedral. Just because it was the biggest building in town, that was my criteria in my church shopping. Just kidding. And I just like going to a church and listening to Bach and Mozart and 16th century music, that big organ and all that stuff. It's pretty awesome. They also burn incense, which is cool. But I'm being a little guarded here because I'm a little cautious talking about my own tradition and my own faith. But I'm actually kind of new to that tradition. I come from the sort of SBNR world, but I found that I needed something a little more communal. It's a little lonely out there. And I wanted a Sangha and a community, and I like that music, and I like the way I feel in that space and with those people. And it's really as simple as that. And the fact that a lot of the people who run that church are gay is important to me too, and that we hang a rainbow flag out front, and we're the first church in the Black Lives Matter parade and all those progressive things. That was really important to me too. And so there are lots of churches like that too. And furthermore, when I look up and down the pews at my church, I know that the 12 people in my row, there are 12 different theologies there. Just because you're all in a room doesn't mean you're all agreeing with everything. We stand up and say the Nicene Creed every Sunday. I can barely get through it. It's so strict and it's so doctrinaire, and it's so like, okay, this is what some 3rd century Christian dudes thought, that it doesn't reflect what I currently feel, but I'll chant it along with you, even though it's not my current position, but it helps me decentralize my own opinions. That maybe sacred experience isn't about just getting together with everybody who agrees with you. Maybe it's about getting together and breaking open and participating in a mystical experience, as you all do here in the puja, in the sacred room in the back, where there is singing and bell ringing. There's not a lot of arguing going on there. And everybody gets to bring themselves, and everybody is respected and seen and heard. So boy, short question, long answer. You really started something there. I'm so sorry I went on so long. Let me stop and leave room for another one. who has the mic, or who would like to ask another question or have a thought? Please. So thank you. And I'll be much more concise. Sure.
If you want to differentiate between philosophy and religion and spirituality, read the gospel, Sri Krishna, there's one time when Swami
Can you speak a little louder? We're having trouble here.
One time when Swami Vivekananda told Sri Krishna that he read a book by Hamilton that it said that the word ignorance is the end of philosophy and the beginning of religion. And Sri Krishna said, thank you. He said, when you hear that. But that's basically what I think philosophy does is like it leads you on a path to becoming a learned person, a person who's no longer ignorant.
Hopefully.
And at that point, that's the beginning of religion. But,
Nice. Did you say Hamilton as in Alexander Hamilton?
I'm not sure who it was.
Yeah.
The last name was Hamilton.
Got it. No, thank you for that. No, that's wonderful. So there's a nice way to sort of see them working together, philosophy and religion.
Yeah, they work together. And a lot of the teachings of the great philosophers like Aristotle and Plato and everyone, I think they're in conjunction with Hindu philosophy anyway.
Yeah. Thank you. No, that's a little bit. I'm reminded of the paragraph you read from my website about how I no longer work very hard to distinguish religion from philosophy. I just call them all wisdom traditions, and to me they're different languages about some of the same things, the big questions. So yeah, please, Swami.
Thank you, Peter. I was wondering if you can maybe cite some examples from Christian mystics. I know you've done courses on Christian mystics in regards to their nature mystical experiences. I'd love to hear, for example, what qualifies a nature mystical experience? And is it when Moses is seeing the fire? Is that a nature mystic experience? Or just give us some examples of what some are.
Nice, sure. So that's a good place to start from Jewish scripture, right? Jewish literature, the story of Moses. I suppose people back then had no choice but to be in wilderness continually, since they were nomadic people who literally lived outside. So all of their contexts are going to be, and their environment is wilderness, storms and the elements and so on. So that's certainly a good example of God speaking to Moses as a voice in the form of a burning bush. The book of Exodus tells us that is not a bush on fire that's not being consumed by the fire, some kind of mystical fire. So there's countless examples in the Hebrew Bible. Jesus, of course, just like Siddhartha Gautama, before we come to call him the Buddha, they have this, they go through the same ordeal, which is they go out into wilderness. Right after Jesus is baptized, the Gospels tell us he goes into the wilderness, or other translations say into the desert, and fasts for 40 days and 40 nights, that sacred number in Jewish practice. About 6 weeks. We're celebrating today the end of Ramadan, right? Where our Muslim brothers and sisters stopped fasting for a month yesterday. So Eid al-Fitr to all of our Muslim friends. That austerity ended with a feast, but the austerity piece is important. Jesus goes into the wilderness, undergoes this time of great denial and austerity. Siddhartha, of course, in the forest went through all of that as well, and then they had their transformational experience. Buddha meets the demon Mara, who gives him 3 temptations. He withstands all 3, and then he awakens, the tradition tells us, as the Buddha, and goes and starts teaching. And Jesus, and 500 years later, withstands Satan's 3 temptations, and then in the wilderness, and then becomes the world savior in that tradition, and comes back to town and gets to work. And so in the Christian tradition, there are many examples of that. The early church mothers and fathers I referenced earlier, so much of the literature of Christian mysticism and monasticism begins there with those earliest voices, largely in Egypt. And before the church became a Roman phenomenon, but then it became part of the Roman Christian tradition after certain key figures, Saint Benedict and the Benedictine order and the Saint Francis. That's the guy who stands in everybody's garden with a little bird on his finger. And so there's a Roman Catholic saint who kind of breaks that medieval, nature is evil, God is good duality. And Saint Francis is this wonderful corrective figure in the Roman Catholic tradition who sort of sanctifies all of the natural world again. It said he would go into the woods and like talk to animals and had this whole relationship with this wolf and convince this wolf to stop eating the farmer's sheep. And so he's like this nature dude who communes with creatures, and that makes nature an important place again. And I'm thinking of Hildegard of Bingen, this incredibly powerful figure in German monastic tradition. The monasteries were places where women could be free from the constraints of marriage and family and patriarchy. And they could live in women-led communities, and they could pursue learning and science. And Hildegard of Bingen is revered in Christianity and in Germany, not just as a powerful mystic, but as really the inventor of natural history in Germany, the chronicler of species and of plant biology and zoology. And she was a real student and scientist of nature. So for her, that was where God could, again, be met most directly. So those are just some examples that kind of come to mind for me. There are many.
Do you think then, is it in going in nature, and you talked about one, there's this thing that be still and know God.
Yeah.
So is it when you get away from all the noise of the world, you start coming within your own mind, and as you start in nature, the midst of your own mind, the noise of your own mind starts to quail down, and then that which is becomes revealed to you? Or is it also in nature when you see something like the beauty of Yosemite or Kailash, the beautiful, that breath, just the mind becomes overwhelmed by the breath and beauty of the place where you are, that it just shuts down, and that which becomes revealed also. What is it about nature that creates that mystical experience?
I think you described it very well, that those are the two things that happen. One is the mind begins to grow quiet. And by the way, that comes after the mind starts to get really loud and crazy. When you're out there away from distractions, that's when you become aware of what a cacophony this is. That what Eckhart Tolle gently calls the thought stream is actually a fire hose, of just blasting thoughts. And any first-time meditator has to gets to experience that firsthand, and they usually stop and they say, no, I can't meditate, I'm not able to meditate. And then all of us who teach meditation convince them, try to convince them, you can. All you have to do is shift into the witness of that thought stream and disengage from it and watch it with the same disinterest with which you would watch leaves floating downstream. And then in that one shift, you've experienced the whole project, which is to become disidentified with your thoughts. And then you can watch the thoughts go by. Oh, Peter Bolland is hungry. Oh, Peter Bolland is bored. Oh, Peter Bolland is working on his Costco list right now. And then you laugh and you let it watch it. You open your hands and you feel the tug of time, pull it away from you and watch it go downstream. And you return again to your breath or to your mantra or whatever your meditation practice is. And then you I shouldn't have said that. You slowly start to realize, and that was what happens in nature. After the explosion, then comes, all right, this is bigger than me. And then the quiet becomes so enveloping and comforting. And then suddenly you have the eyes and the ears and the heart and the mind to look at the same old scenery, but this time something seems to be shimmering through. And I don't remember where, there's something in the Upanishads about that when we see a beautiful sunset or a beautiful mountain, the reason it's so profoundly compelling is not because of the beautiful arrangements of rocks and colors, but because something of the eternal is coming through the veil right then. It's that everything becomes diaphanous. and we are experiencing the eternity, and that eternity is meeting our eternity, and that's that union again. So there's no longer me looking at this beautiful nature. It's all in that passage from Emerson. He says, I disappeared. I became this transparent eyeball. I didn't know where me and God, where one ended and the other began. And there wasn't even an I anymore asking that question. The subject-object duality vanished. In Ashtanga Yoga, we call that samadhi, that final stage of dissolution of the self. What in Buddhism we call anatman, that there is no more I, me, or mine. And that's blissful. That's the Ananda piece. So
Thank you so much. Thank you, Peter. I'd like to, if there are any other questions, we're gonna have a little, is there one more? Okay, well, one more question.
okay.
And then, because we'll have a song by Peter, and we can continue our Q&A in the backyard.
We're gonna go trip out on the garden because it's
Right.
beautiful right now. Yeah.
Thank you again so much. This is the first time I've heard kind of history being brought into spirituality, and it's something that I've always wanted to thank you. You referenced Emerson to Eckhart Tolle, and as somebody who's kind of a self-proclaimed nun. I just heard that term today.
A none of the above?
None of the above.
Cool.
You
You are welcome here.
I'm definitely trying to make sense of, there's this new neo-spiritual that's happening right now too, with a lot of the younger generation, and from that to these history figures that you mentioned, I myself am trying to find how to bridge those and the grains of truth within that, and I just love to hear your thoughts on kind of the new spiritual movements that's been happening, and how to kind of make sense of that and bridge that to Vedanta.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for that. And thank you for sharing a little piece of yourself as well. Yeah, there's this thing called the New Age movement. You ever heard of it? Yeah, it's not new. It's been around since the 60s and 70s, but it got commercialized, and people trying to sell you crystals and stuff. And there used to be a bookstore on University in North Park called the Controversial Bookstore. Is it still there? Any North Parkers here? I don't know. I don't think so. Okay, thank you. When I first moved to San Diego, we lived in North Park, and I would walk over there and just walk up and down the bookshelves with my head like this, reading the bindings, of all these crazy, awesome sounding books. And it was every kind of like astral projection and past life regression. And there's all Shirley MacLaine's books about, claiming that she knows about all her reincarnated lives. And I have an open mind about all that stuff, but I'm also kind of deeply skeptical about a lot of it. I don't know. I have my foot in two worlds there. And yet I was struck by how ancient all of the ideas were, and that what a misnomer New Age was, that it's really these ancient spiritual traditions and practices kind of repackaged for modern seekers. Often repackaged by commercial enterprises who are trying to sell a seminar or a book or whatever. And I'm not disparaging that at all, but it's a bit of a mess, right? When you step into it, here's a book about how to bend nails with your mind, and here's a book about enlightenment, and like, well, I guess I'll get this one, So or UFOs. Oh my God, there's a lot of UFO stuff in those stores too, right? So okay, cool. The state of spirituality today is a real marketplace, a really diverse marketplace. And I choose to see that as a really positive thing. I like it when it's decentralized like that, and that each group gets to continue to do what it does, but there's room for the rest of us out here on the open road to find voices and teachers that speak to us in relatable terms about what Aldous Huxley called the perennial philosophy. And Aldous Huxley, you may know, of course, is this 20th century author and spiritual seeker. And he wrote a book that is a pretty important book in my business called The Perennial Philosophy. And the thesis of the book is right there in the title, that all of the mystical traditions are versions of basically one underlying set of a rather short list of principles about all being one, and I won't go through the whole thing, but so that kind of opened up a possibility for me of seeing all these traditions again as different ways of expressing the same longing and the same union. So I think of religions like languages. They all work, and they are closed systems designed over many centuries, full of signs and symbols and cultural allusions and submerged meanings. And everybody inside the group who learns that code can talk to each other about their shared view of this phenomenal realm. But if you go to the next group over, none of it's going to make any sense. And yet that language is also a perfectly valid closed system of signs and symbols and rituals and traditions. And guess what? In each one of those, there are flaws and misunderstandings and cultural baggage we'd be better off without, and so on and so on and so on. And so that enables me, and I hope it isn't hopelessly naive, to view all religions at their best as valid explanations of real human beings having real spiritual experiences and doing their best to put on the page what is essentially ineffable and beyond all thoughts, all words, and all concepts. And every time you put it on the page, you wreck it and you open it up to horrible distortions and misuse. But that doesn't mean you give up, right? You just stay with the project. And so I'm always caught by the Christians within Christianity who are trying to save their tradition from its worst impulses and its most horrific cruelty and bigotry, which just read the paper. And it's to the point where most of the Christians I know are embarrassed to admit in public that they are a Christian, because when you hear the word Christian, you think, the kind of people who chain themselves around Planned Parenthoods. And most of the Christians I know want nothing to do with that. So imagine how our Muslim brothers and sisters feel. And imagine how our Jewish brothers and sisters feel. They have a long history of being intentionally hunted and marked for extermination by the dominant culture. Go to a synagogue sometime. It's not like this where you just walk in. There's concertina wire, there's security gates, there's ID checks. There's a dude in full army fatigue with an AR-15. They're ready for the war that is being waged against them, because they're not just going to sit and take it anymore. A synagogue in Poway was attacked by a white supremacist. This is a real thing in many spiritual communities. Thank God we in this neck of the woods have not yet been marked in that way, but we know that Asian Americans, et cetera, are under attack. And a lot of those people doing the attacking, sickeningly, call themselves Christians. So I hate to end on such a pessimistic, angry note. Damn, I better do a song or something. Yeah, anyway, y'all are grown up. You know the world we live in. It's a hot mess, but it never ends up, it never stops being beautiful. So for the folks at home, I'm going to play a song in front of the podium. You maybe won't hear me. But should I stand back here and do it?
So if you, just
play this mic here. Okay, good. So I'll just kind of, right let me grab my guitar.
Peter, we want to thank you so much for this beautiful talk. And just want to make an announcement for next week's lecture.
Yes, do that.
You were actually alluding to religions being different paradigms, and each is right within its own paradigm, its own window. So next week's talk is going to be by Swami Vedananda, who is one of our young scholarly monks, and he's really dynamic. He's going to talk about, the topic is same goal, different paths. And in this talk, he's going to talk about how can we reconcile different religions. If we say that different religions and they're talking about their path and the goals seem to be different from one another. So in Vedanta, we're saying, well, it's ultimately one goal. How do we reconcile the different goals of different religions and the different paths? Ultimately, is it from the Vedanta teachings, how do we reconcile that as one ultimate reality? So he's going to go into different paradigms and see if he can try to with the teachings of Vedanta, how to help reconcile. What does that mean?
Perfect.
How does unity exist in all that diversity?
Nice.
Peter, thank you so much. We're gonna have, and then after Peter is done, we ask you to join us in the backyard, be one with nature outside, and we have refreshments, snacks, and continue the conversation with you.
Nice. Wonderful. Well, thanks for inviting me to bring my guitar. I love that about this place. I appreciate it. I wrote a song a couple of months ago when a dear colleague of mine retired. His name was Joel Levine. His name is Joel Levine. He didn't die. But he finally stepped off the hamster wheel at Southwestern College where he and I work. And he retired in December. And, you know, but I don't do this, write commemorative songs for people as a habit, but I was just somehow moved because he was a wonderful colleague. He was one of those leaders that really led with his heart. None of the other deans understood him. He wasn't nearly ruthless enough. And all of us teachers, though, really dug him a lot. And he was a sweetheart. And he helped me out 1,000 times through the years. And I think that about all my colleagues. And then it just expands. I think that about you all here. I think that about meeting Swami, that the people you meet along the way are what make this, are what turn this hell into a heaven. And that's it. You know, it's not answers or theories or theologies. It's the people, and it's the connection that we have with each other. So I wrote this song about Joel, but it's really about all of us, and it's called "The People You Meet Along the Way." Heart is heavy and you're feeling tired, a little overwhelmed, a little uninspired. Well, there's only one thing gonna save the day. It's the people you meet along the way. How they build you up, and how they fill your cup, and how they wipe away the tears when you can't even start, and still they hear your heart when you can't find the words to say. When the load is heavy and the road is long, and you're out of gas and everything's gone wrong. Well, there's only one thing gonna save the day. It's the people you meet along the way, and how they build you up, and how they fill your cup, and how they wipe away the tears when you can't even start, and still they hear your heart when you can't find the words to say. When I lose my legs and I lose my tongue, I won't pity myself or envy the young, 'cause I found treasure every single people we meet along the way. Thank you. Thanks so much. That was nice of you. Appreciate that. All right.
Thank you, Peter. One day we should just have a concert by you.
Well, we can do that. I'm game. I've got some shows coming up. It's all on peterbolland.com.